All right, guys, we're going to talk about the immune system. This is going to serve as a review of all the information that we need to know. So I'm not going to talk very long about it. I'm going to talk kind of an overview. But this is kind of all the information that you need to know for the immune system. All right, what's important to remember is that disease, right? Obviously, we kind of know what disease is, but I want to remind you the phrase that a disease is any condition that prevents the body from maintaining homeostasis. All right. And we're specifically focusing on diseases that are resulting from pathogens or organisms that are foreign invaders. But there's other form of diseases too. We talked about diabetes. We're going to talk about cancer. So those are also diseases, but specifically, we're talking about diseases that are caused by pathogens, right? Any organism that causes disease. And once again, specifically, they stop the body from being able to maintain homeostasis. So we have some different pathogens below, and they have completely different ways that they infect the body and how they're treated. All right, so we have viruses, which are little particles of DNA and protein. If you look, they have these kind of outer proteins that are really, really important, right? Those proteins are going to bind to the cell membrane receptors, trick the cell into getting in. It's going to take over your cell make more virus particles, and then the cell will burst, releasing all of those viruses. One virus goes in and a million come out. All right. And so vaccines are our treatment, which we'll talk about later, but viruses themselves can't really be treated while you're sick with the disease. Then we have bacteria, right? So bacteria are single-celled organisms. They are alive. Some bacteria are good for us and some are not. Okay, so some bacteria, how they actually harm you is by producing toxins or chemicals that eat your tissue. Okay, and we have some common ones. We talked about cholera, pneumonia, syphilis. We talked about strep throat. And this is important. Antibiotics, such as penicillin, are used to treat bacterial infections only. And they work by destroying bacterial cell walls or slowing the growth of bacteria. Don't get that mixed up with antibodies later on. Okay, we didn't talk a lot about fungus, but you can take a look and read about that as a different pathogen. And parasites. We also kind of didn't talk about this, but this is the one you probably have most knowledge about, right? Parasites are organelles or single-celled, or some animals, I'm sorry, and some single-celled organisms that survive inside of other organisms and feed off of them. This is different than a bacteria. Okay, so a bacteria produces a toxin that breaks it down, and then they will eat it. And parasites are somewhat similar, but they're multicellular organisms typically that feed off of you. You can see a picture here. All right, so let's take a second to talk about the microbiome and just remind ourselves that not all bacteria are harmful. And in fact, we need bacteria to stay alive. For example, you have some bacteria that help you digest food and destroy the bad guys in your body. One important topic to talk about is antibiotic resistance. Okay, and so essentially, we know that antibiotics are used to treat infections by killing bacteria. Some of the issues, though, is that antibiotics are overprescribed, meaning doctors prescribe them a lot. Okay, and this can cause some issues. Some strains of bacteria can survive because they have genetic variation. So let's take a look at this picture, right? So we have this kind of pink bacteria here that has a genetic variation that makes it so that it can't be killed by the antibiotic. Well, the antibiotic kills off all of the bacteria except the resistant ones, and then only the resistant will survive. And remember, this is caused by a mutation. All right, so let's talk about some of the ways that our immune system works. Okay, so we're going to look at the steps. So the first step, okay, is to recognize foreign antigens. And antigens are on pathogens, right? So your white blood cells are going around, checking things out, checking to see if things are self or they're foreign. If it's foreign, it's going to trigger an immune response. So white blood cells will attack the invader. One way they do this is actually to swallow the pathogens. Okay, we have these other white blood cells that will attack and kill the pathogen on the spot as well. This is step 3 and 4 are incredibly important, right? Step 3 is some white blood cells make a protein called antibodies. And if you look at this picture, if this is the pathogen right here, okay, and it has these little antigens, right? Then your white blood cell will make these antibodies that fit that antigen perfectly. Antibodies are very specific to the antigen, and only one antibody can really fit specific pathogens. Okay. And this takes time, right? Sometimes the white blood cell doesn't know how to make it. So it might take a few days to learn, okay, this is what the antibody shape needs to look like, right? And once again, this is important. If you make an antibody to a specific pathogen, you cannot use that same antibody to fight another pathogen because antibodies are so specific to the antigen that they're fighting. Making memory cells, okay? Memory cells are so important because they prevent you from continually getting that same disease again, right? So essentially, if you got chickenpox, you would make those antibodies to chickenpox, you would fight it off, and you would create memory cells. And these memory cells are waiting around so that when they see that pathogen again, they can immediately set off an immune response, make millions and millions of antibodies, and fight it off before you even get sick, right? So memory cells will remain with the memory of the antigen so that that pathogen will be killed right away. All right, once again, let's just make sure we remember the difference between antigens and antibodies. And here's my little trick. Antigens are proteins on pathogens, right? Antibodies are proteins our body makes to fight pathogens. And I just have a couple kind of pictures here that will help you as well to show you that, you know, for each pathogen, whether it be measles, flu, chickenpox, the antibody will fit it perfect and they all look different. I want to remind you, please don't mix this up with antibiotics. Those are medicine that treat bacteria only. Okay, that's different than antigens and antibodies. Let's talk about vaccinations. Okay, magic phrase here is dead or weakened form of a pathogen that stimulates the immune response, right? I liked the idea of a wanted poster. You're kind of giving the body a wanted poster, showing them, hey, this is what the disease looks like. This is how you fight it, right? So that when it actually comes in real life, your body already knows how to fight it. So you send in a dead or weakened form of the pathogen, it sends off an immune response, your body makes antibodies and memory cells so that when it sees it in real life, it already has those things. All right, let's talk about allergies. Our magic phrase for allergies are normally harmless substance, right? And so our body kind of accidentally mistakes a peanut protein, for example, or pet dander protein or grass protein as a foreign invader. Although remember, it's not a pathogen, right? Because it can't make you sick, but your body thinks that it does. So it sets off an immune response. We didn't talk a lot about transplanted organs. So let's take a second and talk about that. So let's say somebody needs an organ transplant. Let's say their liver failed, or let's say that they get a different heart valve from either a person or a cow, right? Or pig. The issue with organ transplant is that those organs have a different antigen, right? They have somebody else's antigen. And so when the white blood cells go around shaking hands, they shake hands with that organ and they're like, whoa, this isn't me, right? And so they start attacking that organ. And this is called organ rejection. Okay. And one way that we kind of avoid this is every person who has a transplanted organ will have to take drugs that weaken their immune system. And those are called immunosuppressants. And the issue with immunosuppressants, right, is that we're suppressing the immune system. So it's harder to fight off pathogens. So that is a negative, but of course, it still extends your life. Let's take a moment to talk about some specific diseases. We're going to talk about two. Okay, so the first one is AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. And what's important to remember is that AIDS is caused by a virus, the human immunodeficiency virus, and that specifically attacks the white blood cells, okay, which weakens the immune system. Makes it so that you could die from the common cold or a similar disease, okay, that usually wouldn't harm somebody else and make them die, right? And remember, this is not curable, although we do have medication currently to slow it down. HIV virus constantly mutates all the time. And so that's why we are struggling to find a vaccine. And just a reminder about vaccines, right? If the virus mutates or easily mutates, we typically can't make a vaccine for it, right? Because that vaccine that we initially gave would be invalid if that virus mutates maybe a couple weeks later, right? Kind of like the COVID virus, right? We didn't talk a lot about malaria. So malaria is caused by a parasite. Okay, so basically a parasite, it lives in a mosquito. Okay, and that mosquito isn't really harmed, but when that mosquito bites the human or other organisms, it will pass that parasite called malaria to the other person. So a mosquito gets this by actually sucking the blood of an infected person with malaria. They get the malaria inside of them. It doesn't hurt the mosquito, but then they pass it along. All right, that is going to sum up our review of the immune system today. I appreciate you listening and being patient.